relevant to the human experience, from the molecular and cellular levels all the way through the social, anthropological, and existential dimensions of our life. And we also aim to establish a mindfulness-based clinical enterprise at the USC School of Medicine at some point. But we're starting really focused in on promoting scientific investigation and bringing in some of the world's most knowledgeable and engaged researchers in these domains, which is where Dr. Vago comes in today. Our website can be found at mindfulscience.usc.edu. You can also click there if you want to join our listserv and you're not part of it yet. And today, the Mindfulness Science keynote is being delivered by Dr. David Vago on the topic of mapping the meditative mind. David is director for the Contemplative Neuroscience and Integrative Medicine Laboratory, and also research director at the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at Vanderbilt University. He's an associate professor in the departments of psychiatry and physical medicine and rehabilitation at Vanderbilt School of Medicine, and also maintains appointment as a research associate at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He received his bachelor's degree in brain and cognitive science in 1997 from the University of Rochester, and in 2005 finished his PhD in cognitive and neurosciences with a specialization in learning and memory from the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah. Dr. Vago completed his postdoctoral training in 3 locations: the Utah Medical School Center for Mind-Body Interactions, the Department of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, and the Stuart T. Hauser Research Training Program in Biological and Social Psychiatry at Harvard. David has also previously held the position of Senior Research Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute and is currently a Mind and Life Fellow. In addition to his longstanding interest in and contribution to the field of contemplative neuroscience, he's a meditator himself, studying the effects of meditation from a first-person perspective, has been a practitioner of Vipassana and Dzogchen styles of meditation for about 25 years. On a personal note, David is also a good friend, and it's just a great pleasure to be able to host you here today, David, through the Center for Mindfulness Science.
Thank you so much, Rael. It's for that really nice introduction, and really great that we could make this format happen today. I was excited to be in sunny California, and now we are having this opportunity to be much more international in our reach here. So it's really great to see all these amazing faces on Zoom on beautiful Earth Day, 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So yeah, it's really just a pleasure, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be with you all today. So I hope we can spend a little time talking about mindfulness, and painting some broad strokes, depending. I figure there's a lot of people out there who are very familiar with mindfulness as a construct, as a concept, and as a practice. But I do want to also try to be a little bit more sensitive to the broader sort of audience that's out there. So I will try to focus a little bit on the introduction about mindfulness as a general practice and what we know about it, and then go into more detail about the science. That sound about right? And so if there's any questions along the way, please do maybe jot them down and hold them maybe towards the end. You can, I think, Rael, you were saying you could raise your hand if there's a way to do that through Zoom, and then we will try to take your questions at the end. Is that right?
That's right. At the very end, I'll give that brief instruction about how to raise your hand if you want to ask some questions, and I'll moderate that part at the end. So we just ask that you keep any questions you have for that time.
And so I'm going to try to get this started here. Try to, let's see here, slideshow. Come over here and do this. Let's see if this works. Okay, so everyone should see the first slide. If I see some nodding heads, that could be helpful. Okay, I see some nodding heads. All right, great. Again, I'm going to get right into it. I appreciate all you showing up today. And really, I'm going to talk about the last 45 years. Of course, there's been a lot of progress in the science of mindfulness and meditation. And what I really want to do with you all is talk about where we're coming from and where we're going. And we're slowly approaching a level of precision to better understand the mechanisms by which these practices function, and really better understand how they function to support a healthy mind and body, and how they can best serve select populations. And mapping the meditative mind is an initiative in my lab and in an emerging field of contemplative neuroscience that really is aiming to better understand the contemplative experience using a combination of both neuroimaging and first-person introspective methods. And this allows us to take what we refer to as a neurophenomenological approach towards identifying the brain network interactions and systems of functioning to support different meditation practices, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, from the novice meditator who may only have had a short amount of training to the advanced practitioners and monastics who have dedicated a lifetime to meditation practice. So we also use EEG to better understand the neurophysiology supporting mindfulness with a much better temporal resolution than MRI. And this is what you see here is a raw signal of electrical activity, and that can be mapped across the scalp. So we can characterize where the activity is happening, while what we refer to as event-related potentials can provide information about when activity is happening and the magnitude of brain power allocated in response to relevant stimuli like emotional triggers. So the benefits of having a map, there are always pros and cons to doing, to creating a map in any scientific context. But these maps that we're trying to create can be used for identifying targets for therapeutic purposes. They can be used for predicting outcomes in clinical populations. It can be used as a diagnostic tool, and it can be used for navigation of progress by the practitioner in long-term practice effects. And so what I want to emphasize is that this initiative is not just about this third-person perspective, which science and neuroscience specifically has really focused on, like what is happening on the inside of the brain from the outside. But this initiative also aims to map the experience of mind from the inside, an embodied and relational perspective. And to make this point clear, we can take Dogen's understanding of the way. Dogen was a 13th century Zen master and founder of the Soto school of Zen, who emphasized this aspect of focusing and studying the self. And he said, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. And to be enlightened by all things is to remove the barriers between oneself and others. And when he says, what he's referring to really is this no-self doctrine found across schools of Buddhism. And I'm not going to go into detail about that particular doctrine, but I will emphasize the aspects of the introspective process that Dogen may be referring to. That's where one is reflecting upon one's own mental habits and worldview, seeing those patterns, our needs, our wants, our fears, and expectations, and how they can be viewed in a relational way to better understand and better able to empathize with and share a common worldview with others. So we can see things not only more clearly as they truly are, but also share a common perspective between self and other. And this can happen in such a way that those boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, and our perspective becomes more non-dual and more unified. And this non-dual perspective is also part of the map we are investigating. So in a science of meditation and contemplative experience, we want to better understand what we've learned in the last 45 years and how this practice of meditation and mindfulness has impacted society. So meditation, just to give a sort of broad background, meditation started to become trendy in the 1970s when the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi introduced the Beatles to transcendental meditation. And one thing that is clearly changed since then is that you no longer need dreadlocks and a beard. You just need to be beautiful and blonde to experience the benefits. And more recently in 2018, as indicated by this Time magazine cover, you can now have brown hair to experience the new mindfulness. And so this is where we're at. There is an insurgence of not just the science since the 1970s, but there's a great interest from the mainstream popular press as well. And you see that in this depiction of Time magazine. But in all seriousness, more and more people are practicing meditation. 18 million people in the US reported meditating at least once in 2012, right? This is about 8% of the entire US population. And in 2017, that number has tripled to about 14% of the population, about 35 million people. So why are more people meditating now than they ever have been? Is it because of Time magazine and those pictures? Potentially. I like to also think that part of the reason is due to science. The science has also been improving. We're starting to see that even from 1970s, the first journal article in Science, the journal Science, where transcendental meditation was reported and for different physiological factors of the heart, of cardiac function and respiratory function, to 2010, when there was a journal that was created specifically for mindfulness research, and then most recently in 2018 on the journal Pain, some of the work that was done by Fadel Zaidan on acute pain in meditators was with a short amount of meditation training, was highlighted by the cover of Pain, the journal Pain. So we've made a lot of progress, right? But you may think that there's a lot of research out there when you say there's over 10,000 peer-reviewed articles with mindfulness or meditation in the title or abstract. 92% of those articles happened in the last 20 years after the year 2000. 10,000 articles sounds like a lot, but for comparison, there have been over 120,000 articles for something like cardiovascular disease. So what I want to continue to emphasize is that although it may appear that there's a lot of science being done already in the last 45 years, we are still in infancy in terms of what we know about the science of meditation, and we have a lot further to go to better answer questions such as, what is the minimum amount of time necessary to achieve benefit from these practices? Or what are the practices that are going to benefit one population over another population? Those kinds of questions have not yet been answered. But what I will show you today is a reflection of what we do know. Of course, we have to keep in mind that mindfulness is also being commodified to appropriately fit the needs of our culture. The two biggest apps being Headspace with 40 million downloads at this point, and Calm, valued at $320 million and $1 billion respectively. There's been over 2,000 new meditation apps launched between 2015 and 2018. So these are really indicators of how meditation is of interest to people. However, even though the ongoing research has been encouraging, mindfulness specifically has been getting oversold by much of the news media relative to the available scientific evidence for supporting its benefits. And so much so that 14 of my colleagues and I, just a few years ago, wrote this critical evaluation of the literature and a prescriptive agenda for future research with the hopes of tempering some of the hype and pointing out some of the limitations. So the reflections were not really meant to be discouraging. There is good evidence that mindfulness training has positive effects on health and well-being. That is the real take-home. The question is the more nuanced way of looking at the data. And so that I hope to give you some slice of that today. So in the time we have together, I hope to contextualize mindfulness from the monastery to the mindfulness-based intervention, refer to it as really a systematic process of mental training, talk about the mechanisms by which these practices function to improve self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence. And this will be done by illustrating some of the system-based models of core mindfulness practices and the underlying neurobiology supporting those practices, and then how that fits into the evidence for clinical health. And I'll talk about a few different initiatives in my lab and others that refer to mapping the meditative mind, targeting specific mechanisms of mindfulness-based interventions in some grants and big trials that are happening currently in acute and chronic pain, and also the literature that's currently out there. This will be very new data of systematic reviews and meta-analyses specifically looking at what the data shows today about what mindfulness-based interventions are doing to improve cognition, emotion, and self-related processing. So in order to properly contextualize mindfulness, we need to acknowledge that generally speaking, there are at least two main perspectives from which this concept of mindfulness originates: a 2,700-year-old model and a 40-year-old model. Now you can imagine 40 years ago in the spring of 1979, if you don't recognize this man, 40 years ago, he was a 34-year-old molecular biologist and long-term practitioner of yoga and meditation named John Kabat-Zinn. And he had a vision, which lasted about 10 seconds in his words, which he refers to as his karmic assignment, a model for how to share the essence of all his own contemplative trainings through the concept of mindfulness. And this idea was to spread mindfulness through hospitals and medical centers as a practical path to liberation from suffering. And he refers to mindfulness as really an umbrella term for the entire Buddha Dharma. So it's a doorway into something much grander than stress reduction, more of a way of being. And so we have to at least keep in mind what the goals and context are for these two main models, right? So one may be for stress reduction, well-being, for more relaxation, to improve attention. And the other is much more grander with the goal of enlightenment, right? So the goals and context for these two different paths may be very different, but there are common threads that we can study as well, which we can refer to as the content, like the meditation practices that are being done and the process by which they are being studied or by which they are being experienced. So that's where I'm going to focus a lot in the next few minutes that I have with you, is the content and the process. So in 2012, I created this system-based model of mindfulness that operationalized the concept broadly as a systematic method of mental training. And that's why you see this little brain there trying to lift weights. Really just like going to the gym to work out our physical muscles, the idea is these practices are helping to flex our mental muscles, to reduce suffering and develop a healthy mind. And in this framework, we describe how the core practices may work to facilitate greater awareness of our mental habits. And we can explore this by looking at attentional biases inherent in our habitual forms of cognition. We can also look at how these practices improve the regulation of destructive thoughts and emotions, such as craving, greed, anger, hatred, worry, and these types of emotional experiences. This is really referred to as self-regulation. And lastly, the framework emphasizes development of a positive relationship between self and other, that transcends the self-focused needs, increases those pro-social behaviors, and just like Dogen was referring to, this aspect of the non-duality of self and other, the dissolving of those boundaries between self and other. So that's the framework by which we are operating from. So how does it work? How do we describe how these processes function? These two papers are probably the best papers that I can point out to you. They refer to these specific mechanisms by which we have articulated how these processes function. And now we are in the times of testing these models to better understand how these mechanisms are truly functioning. So the core mindfulness-based practices that we focus on are a focused attention or concentration meditation. And this could be any sort of single-pointed object, breath or body focus, an open monitoring or receptive form of meditation like open awareness, shikantaza, choiceless awareness, an ethical enhancement or constructive-based practices like loving kindness and metta, and lastly, movement-based practices like yoga, tai chi, qigong, or walking meditation. So these are the four core practices that are typically showing up in a mindfulness-based intervention. They're not the only ones, but they're pretty good at sort of encompassing the typology of practices that exist. And so what we did was we created these system-based process models by how these practices are functioning. So what is happening in our minds and in our brains, why we actually practice these meditation practices. So I'll focus on only one of the practices today as I outline exactly how we conceptualize how the focused attention practice works in our mind and our brain. And so for those of you who don't have a lot of background in neuroscience, I've color-coded things so it's a little easier to follow. But each one of these processes has an underlying neurobiology supporting it. So we start off with this framework of motor learning. So just like any skill, the more you practice, the better you get, and the less effort is required. The intention and motivation is also key to these practices because as you look in the literature, you see, why do people practice? For the most part, people start off as being a very self-centered type of motivation. They want to improve themselves, decrease their stress, improve attention, improve efficiency, and that's the motivation. It's very self-serving. It's very self-help oriented. But the motivation changes over time. And in fact, what you see is that people continue the practice after something like 8 weeks through a motivation that's more altruistic, that's more other-focused. And that's something we have to also keep in mind in terms of these models. You are given a set of instructions to focus your attention on the breath, and that requires focused attention. It requires working memory. You can study how people are alert and oriented towards the object of attention, like the breath, how well they engage on that object, and how well they monitor that object of attention. And this is the practice that we refer to as mental stabilization. This is also described in that way through shamatha or in vipassana practice, this just focusing on doing anapanasati or breath meditation. And these aspects of practicing the focused attention meditation are supported by very specific networks of brain functions. So I point out a number of brain networks here, and we'll focus on these ones specifically because they're most often targeted by meditation. The orange network is much, I'll emphasize the orange network more than any other network. It refers to a frontal parietal network that involves the frontal polar cortex, the parts of the insular cortex, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and parts of the parietal lobe as well. Now, of course, other networks get involved as you pay attention to sensory aspects of experience. You're going to see activation of sensory networks or central executive networks, and parts of the non-conscious forms of paying attention could activate dorsal attention or premotor networks that are active before there's even conscious awareness. So those are the networks that have been targeted for mental stabilization. As we all know, once we have a level of distraction, there's an unintended object, and that typically involves activation of some habitual affective response or some sort of memory. And we refer to this experience as rumination or mental proliferation. And this is supported by a network called the default mode network. Very often, this is where we spend the majority of our lives. But if we're doing a meditation practice, how do we know when we enter this state of rumination? The idea is that through practice, we strengthen this executive monitoring function such that we have this ability to decenter from those thoughts and emotions that may be coming up in rumination. And just to emphasize what this decentering process really is, you see it rear its head in many forms of therapy, psychotherapy. And the idea is that you have a thought, a general idea about your own self. I'm not good enough. And by giving yourself some psychological distance, you are no longer reifying that construct of I'm not good enough as your own self, but you're having more meta-awareness about or metacognition about those thoughts rather than identifying with it specifically. And that cartoon should help you understand that what we mean by distance from those thoughts. By moving into that distancing state, we're able to improve our response inhibition and regulate our emotions. We develop equanimity and more clarity in the way we experience different sensory modalities. And that is also supported by this orange network in terms of inhibiting responses or impulse control and executive monitoring functioning. So that's the general model by which a focused attention meditation practice functions. These are the 6 neurocognitive and psychosocial mechanisms that are taken or extracted from that process. So intention and motivation moves from effortful to effortless. It moves from self-focused to other-focused types of motivations. Attention is regulated such that stability is improved. There is increased inhibition and flexible engagement of attention. There's improved meta-awareness, and this is happening through the decentering and monitoring process. Emotions are better regulated, and you develop equanimity, so you're able to flexibly come back to baseline much faster after you have an emotional stressor. There's more inhibitory control of those emotions. There's extinction and reconsolidation of mental habits that may have been maladaptive, and biases are shifting towards more adaptive trajectories. The prosociality mechanism is that you're increasing empathy, theory of mind, and your motivations are becoming more altruistic. And then there's a more embodied cognition. So your experience of the world becomes more bottom up rather than in a predictive coding perspective from the top down. So you're not expecting the world as much, but you're allowing yourself to just be more embodied in the experience. And so these are the 6 mechanisms that are currently being tested by many labs around the world right now, but they're the best sort of illustration of how these practices are functioning. So there's a number of initiatives that we have in our lab and in others to test these mechanisms. I'm only going to focus on a few today, given our time is short. So I'm going to focus on just the mapping in the meditative mind initiative and the self-regulatory mechanisms that are based around mindfulness-based interventions. So this initiative specifically is looking at long-term practice effects, brain, mind, body patterns, and phenomenology associated with long-term practitioners. So I'm going to share some data our team has collected with 2 different styles of meditation training in adept practitioners, one coming from the Unified Mindfulness System with Shinzen Young, and the other one called the Pointing Out the Great Way with Daniel Brown. So working with Shinzen Young, we focused on a noting and labeling method with origins from the Bhutanese teacher Mahasi Sayadaw. And in Shinzen's system, there's an emphasis on 3 specific modalities of awareness: visual, auditory, and somatic. And the idea here is that all sensory, emotional, and cognitive experience can be mapped onto these 3 different modalities of awareness. And so I will focus on a study that we did, but briefly talk about one aspect of the data just given their time together, but we were able to map the different modalities in the brain, and they all have very unique signatures that the meditators were able to move through uniquely. So we looked at both novice and advanced practitioners and used formal sitting meditation hours as a metric for experience. The experts varied between around 1,000 hours to close to about 12,000 hours of formal meditation practice time. We also ruled out a current history of psychopathology to make sure that that was a clean sample when we're looking at brain structure and brain function. It's really hard to tease out what the meditation may be doing if there's a confound of some form of psychopathology underlying that. And we looked at, we had 22 novices who were trained in 6 formal 2-hour sessions through a webinar platform, and home practice was quantified through a mobile application. So in the scanner, we were interested specifically in the phenomenology of clarity. And the clarity is described as a point where there's clear contact with the state, and the state is intensely present. And the practitioners could indicate when they achieved the state with a button press. And, and we did this because of the fact of most fMRI analyses will average blocks of time of the bold signal over, say, a 5-minute chunk of meditation. And that often gives you a mixed signal of how aware people's minds are in their meditation practice. As many of you probably know, in your meditations, you're not always at this stable peak clarity throughout your entire 30-minute sit, are you? Right? There's fluctuations, right? So we wanted to capture those moments of peak clarity phenomenologically and match that with the underlying neuroscience. So if they lost concentration grossly, they were able to also indicate with a thumb press. And if they came back into peak clarity, they can also indicate with an index finger press. And they did this over a 32.5-minute block of time where they went into these different states of modality-specific meditation. So here's one example of one subject who had a certain number of hours of formal experience. This is the 32.5-minute, each run had 32.5 minutes of time where they went through mind wander. In Shinzen system, he had meditations referred to as feel rest, hear rest, a do nothing practice, which really is an open awareness style of practice, and see rest. And MWs are states of non-discursive or discursive mind wandering, really, so really non-meditative states. And each time you see a 6 is when they actually hit the button that they are in this peak state of clarity. And then we were able to model that, the bold response around that button press. So I'm only going to, we did a whole brain voxel-wise random effects general linear model to examine the effect sizes of these key contrasts of looking at the different meditative states versus the non-meditative mind wandering states. And we looked at the plateau magnitudes in the bold signal to examine the peak states against the non-meditative rest state. So in the open monitoring or do nothing practice with the adepts, what you find was a significant increase in activity in the striatum, in an area of the brain that is referred to in this blue network as an area that's really important for skill-based learning. So like I said in our model, we described how things become more effortless over time. You would expect more increases in activity in the striatum, in the basal ganglia in general, when people get more proficient at their practice, which is what you see here, reflected here. There was also a decrease in the posterior cingulate cortex or precuneus, which is a major node in the default mode network, which is very commonly now described in the meditation neuroscience literature, and that was supportive of that finding. Now, even more interesting we found was the correlation of the expertise, so the hours of formal practice with bold response. And what we found was that there was a high significant correlation with activation in a major node in this orange network, the frontal parietal control network, and the formal hours of sitting practice. And you can see that in this graph here. And also very interesting was there was a negative correlation with activity in the amygdala, in the limbic areas of the brain, usually responsible for emotion reactivity. And just to show you how this phenomenologically maps out, this is a graph of the bold signal change across the different subjects. And the decreases that you see here are decreased activity or a decreased activity in those particular subjects with the highest amount of formal meditation experience. And these are the ones with less amount of formal meditation experience. And you can see that the increased activity in the amygdala matched very well with their own subjective reports of saying they were fearful or anxious in the scanner at that time. Or my left leg began to twitch and made me uncomfortable. So there was more increases in activity in the amygdala. So that the nice part about this is that the phenomenology matched the neurobiology as well. So the nice thing also about this data was that it is supported by the meta-analyses that have been done. There's been about 80 different neuroimaging studies as of 2014, which was the last meta-analysis done by Kieran Fox from Kalina Christoph's lab. And there's been a few other meta-analyses done, but in general, there's been about 80 different neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging studies of meditators that could fit into this cross-sectional type of meta-analysis. And of those studies, we can say most generally how the brain has changed in size. This is the morphological findings. And what you see here is areas of the orange and yellow networks, the insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the frontal polar cortex. These are most commonly shown to be changing in size as a result of all the different meditation practitioners and all the different styles of practice that were looked at cross-sectionally. Now, if we look at the functional findings, there was actually only about 25 studies that were included here that passed the rigorous standards for a meta-analysis. And you see that the functional activity was also very similar to the morphological changes in the brain. So that makes sense. The more you use these brain areas, the more they change in size. And the only differences were that there were some bilateral increases in activity in the insula, so also part of that frontal parietal network. Increases in activity in the striatum, like we talked about earlier, also supported by the findings that we found. Increases in activity in working memory parts of the brain, like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and inhibitory control aspects of brain processing, like the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and decreases in activity in parts of the inferior parietal lobe and the posterior cingulate cortex. So these findings are starting to show a pretty common pattern that we can start to summarize, and that really is supported by a lot of the other literature. For example, this is the one that's commonly referred to by Matt Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert, where they look at 250,000 samples from about 5,000 people in 83 different countries of what they typically do, sampling their everyday activities throughout their days. I was actually a subject on this study, and you would get a notification on your cell phone. What are you doing right now? How do you feel? So on and so forth. And what they found was that people mind wandered about 47% of the time during their day, no matter what they were doing, and it was causally linked to their unhappiness. So that's not to say that mind wandering is bad. There's a lot of evidence showing that mind wandering is actually quite good for incubation of creative ideas, for goal setting, and for planning. And so one of the ideas is not that meditation just suppresses the default mode network overall, but that it allows you to flexibly switch between those different networks. And Judd Brewer's lab has also looked at this in meditators and found that meditators are better at decreasing the signal in that posterior cingulate cortex, or the default mode network in general, also supporting the findings that are out there most generally. Some of the original work by Sarah Lazar and her group in long-term meditators found that there was increased cortical thickness in areas of the frontal polar cortex and the insula, two areas specifically involved in this frontal parietal network, and two areas that are typically also susceptible to age-related atrophy. And so what the idea here is that meditators, or the act of meditation, may also be a protective factor for age-related atrophy that you typically see in older people. Now, moving on to a developmental model and to better understand states and stages of skill development across time. Poppy Schoenberg, who is a senior scientist in my lab, and I recently proposed this developmental stage model for meditative states that attempts to capture state and trait changes as one progresses in one's meditation practice. And in order to test this model, this is some evidence that she collected with Dan Brown in the Pointing Out the Great Way, which is a Mahamudra Dzogchen tradition. It's very specifically grounded in this teacher-student relationship, where whenever there's a problem or an obstacle, that the teacher is there to help move you through that obstacle into advance into higher stages. And the way that this very unique style of practice works is that there are 4 discrete mind states that people can move through progressively. And this study specifically looked at 30 different practitioners with expertise that was actually determined by the teachers who were invited to participate, who rated the advancement of those particular practitioners on a scale of 10, and anyone who was greater than a 6 was included in the study. And so these 4 different discrete states were described as ocean and waves, refinement of resolution, really moving into spatial awareness and boundlessness. And remember, this is moving into very non-dual states of awareness. So you're moving straight from concentration all the way into stage 4, which was what's described as unified compassion and stabilized awakening state. And what she was able to find was that this gamma band activity in the brain is typically described as a mechanistic way of cohering or gluing all of our experiences into one coherent sort of percept. And there's some data that suggests that gamma band activity is as a frequency in which the brain starts to resonate when there's very little distraction and high levels of concentration and awareness in meditation. And what Poppy was finding was a drop-off in the current density magnitude of this gamma band from baseline into stage 1, and then a gradual increase in power of the gamma band, specifically in the anterior cingulate cortex region, which was also part of that frontal parietal network. And doing some of this wavelet theory analysis, she found that the different frequency ranges were changing across time. From state 1, and this is really just a graphical way of depicting different frequency ranges of brain activity. And moving from state 1 phenomenologically into something like state 4, which is more non-dual, they found a dramatic doubling of the amplitude practically of almost all the different frequency ranges. And they came from mostly frontal and parietal areas, but also were found in occipital areas as well. So more data supporting frontal parietal networks and the gamma band specifically, but also more generally across different frequencies across the brain, moving in a trajectory across different states. So that's sort of the long-term practitioner view. let's just move into more of the short-term practitioner view, what we typically see in 8-week mindfulness-based interventions. I want to show you data that comes from a multi-site grant. We have 12 different COIs. This comes from a really lovely collaboration that I've been nurturing for many years when I was in Boston with Sarah Lazar, Zev Schumann-Olivier, and a whole bunch of people, really amazing practitioners and scientists who we created this grant together, and it really shows you how collaborative science can work really well. And this was one of the largest grants given for mindfulness research, and the idea was to identify self-regulatory targets that are engaged by mindfulness practice. And this was also related to the science of behavior change at the NIH, which was very interested in how these self-regulatory targets could then be engaged to help change behavior. So in this collaboration, we've done systematic reviews, specifically interested in looking at cognitive, emotional, and self-related processing outcomes. And what we did was we looked at all mindfulness-based interventions that included a control group, so at least a passive or an active control, whether it's treatment as usual or wait list, or some active control like sort of therapy that was matched for time and attention. And we had to make sure that the modifications that were done to so many of these studies were at least 75% of what's typically prescribed SR or MBCT, and that means 75% of the time in a meeting in person, or the homework that was prescribed as well. And that means also that at least 50% of the original content was also included. And it was very hard to actually get enough of those studies included because there were so many studies that modified the typical 26-hour prescription. And so by doing this, we found only 72 studies that focus on emotion-related constructs, 14 that looked at self-related processing, and only 8 that targeted cognitive processing. So we had to go back and modify our inclusion criteria so that we could include some of the other MBIs, mindfulness-based interventions, that were at least 2 sessions and included some level of homework. And then there were some studies like Fadel Zaidan, for example, who looked at 4 20-minute sessions of meditation that showed changes in cognition. So we wanted to include those somehow, even though there was no homework. We do report on those in the discussion as well. So we were able to then get 28 studies in total. And what we did was, out of all the studies, I'll focus on cognition first. So of the 28 studies, there were about 159 total assays, meaning different cognitive tests were used to measure cognition. And of those assays of cognition, 19.5% of the outcomes showed that the MBI outperformed a control. 62% showed that they're non-inferior or equal to the control. And only 1% showing the control outperformed the mindfulness-based intervention. And so I think that's an important point to show that a lot of these trials now are not trying to demonstrate that mindfulness-based interventions are better than treatment as usual or some sort of active control that's rigorous in design, like the health enhancement program, but that they are at least equivalent. And if they are, that still means that they are good. And now we have to determine which people are going to benefit most from which type of intervention. And so if you look at those 28 studies and those 159 assays, you can show that those assays that outperform the control, what aspects of cognition are affected? 49% showed that inhibition or switching was most likely or most affected more than the control, or outperformed the control, whereas 32% outperformed in attention processing and 19% in terms of memory. Now, after doing this, and we published this in Current Opinions, which was like a preview of the Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, we teamed up with a group coming out of UCL and RNL and University of Surrey, and it's now a much larger meta-analysis that we're doing, and much more nuanced to look at the studies beyond 2015, this was really reflective of 2000 to 2015. And now we're including studies up to 2019. And what we're seeing is that the effects are starting to replicate, but that there is more of a positive effect for older adults. And this is very preliminary, but I wanted to share that that was some of the interest and news coming from this new meta-analysis. Interesting. Now, if we looked at the self-related processing effects, I'm going to summarize and just say, of those 14 studies, there were really only 5 constructs of self-related processing that have been studied: self-compassion, self-evaluation, negative self-related rumination, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. And of those 5 different constructs, the MBIs significantly outperform inactive control groups only in the engagement of self-compassion and negative self-related rumination. There was no effects on the self-related processing and active controls. So the inactive control groups only, and only in self-compassion and rumination. That's a very important finding in terms of what we know. In the emotion-related outcomes, there were about 36 that could be used in meta-analysis. And you can see here the p-values of inactive versus active controls. And for all the inactive controls, there was significance. The MBIs significantly outperformed the inactive control groups for symptoms of depression, anxiety, and some small effects for stress. If you can see here the significance and the effect sizes are here. But the effect sizes were not as strong for stress. And there were no significant differences when compared with active control. So they were basically equivalent or non-inferior to the active control studies. So again, take this with a grain of salt. It's not saying that mindfulness-based interventions are not good, but that they are equivalent to a lot of the active control interventions that are out there. And so our job now is to figure out which practices are best for which populations, and to identify how they may be best used to optimize targeted delivery of these practices. So the limitations that we find in this context are there's variable criteria that define what a mindfulness-based intervention are. We're not clear on what the active ingredients are. There are many modifications and new generations of different formats. We don't really have a good handle on how a mobile delivery of these formats are in comparison to in-person delivery. There are dosage effects that we still don't understand because people who are involved in these interventions don't always do the homework, and some people do. So we need to more examine how the relation of these effects with dosage effects. There's non-specific effects, teacher-student alliance. When the teacher is like, this is going to help you, we know, evidence says so, look at the New York Times, look at Time Magazine, go to Whole Foods, you'll see it on the cover of magazines. There's an expectation that it will help you. So that in itself, these biases are influencing the outcomes. So we have to be a little bit more creative on how we are using placebo to generate some of these findings. We're also limited by the assays that were used to measure these outcomes. If we're just taking self-report measures off the shelf, or even cognitive measures off the shelf, and saying, okay, we're going to use a Stroop task that measures attention, and meditation should improve attention, so let's look, and then there's no effect, we shouldn't just dismiss that finding. We should be more creative in how we come up with assays to measure attention. The methodological quality of these trials are still very low, and that's okay because it's an emerging science. The trials are now getting very big and rigorous with over 200 subjects in a trial. That's the kind of science that we need to be doing now, and that's what's happening. So at least there's hope that the rigor in which the science is happening is improving. Also I should say that sometimes the effects is not that that outcomes in the mindfulness-based interventions are improving in those who engage in a mindfulness-based intervention, but that there are decreases in performance in the control group. And that gives you a biased view of the data. And so there's a lot of data out there with this pattern that we have to be just aware of. Okay, so with this mindfulness research collaborative of the 12 different COIs, we have now a number of different studies that are ongoing that we're using specifically to target these self-regulatory mechanisms and then see if we can optimize delivery of the interventions. So I'm going to focus just on actually just what's called the mechanisms of MBI's trial that we have at Vanderbilt University. One study that this is based off of comes from work that we did with introducing mindfulness training to women diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia is a chronic pain condition with widespread muscle tenderness, chronic pain, fatigue, and other clinical symptoms. And we found patients have high levels of anxiety and fear associated with their pain. And this manifests in what we refer to as attentional biases, where you see hypervigilance or facilitated attention to threat. And then there's followed by some sort of avoidance from that threat. And then once they engage with threat, they have disengaging from threat. All of these findings were found to shift as a result of the meditation training. And we looked at a group of fibromyalgia patients exposed to a mindfulness-based intervention versus a treatment as usual control group. There was improvements in levels of pain, from levels of worst pain, quality of life improved, state levels of anxiety decreased. So a lot of these clinical improvements, but we wanted to understand why. So we used this dot probe task to examine attentional biases for pain-related content. And we could look at how people are biased towards or avoiding pain-related words, and whether they're disengaging rapidly or not in a healthy way. And so I want to summarize the findings here. What you're looking at is the women exposed to the mindfulness-based intervention are in green, and the control group are in red. And we're going to just focus on the attentional bias index. When you show these emotional stimuli, the pain-related words, at 100 millisecond duration, there was more biases towards the threatening stimuli in the mindfulness-based intervention group. And that's indicated here in the positive bar. In the control group, displayed a more negative attentional bias index down here, suggesting more avoidance in really early stages of processing. So hypervigilance and avoidance was clearly prevalent and was shifting as a result of mindfulness-based treatment. And if you look at later on in processing, 500 milliseconds is about the time when people start to process information, and you can see if they get stuck thinking about something, so it interferes with their ongoing task demands. And what you find is that those exposed to mindfulness were able to disengage rapidly from these cues. And so what we're doing now in my lab is work by Raish Gupta, who is a graduate student, looking at ERP responses specifically to emotional cues and probes in the same sort of a dot probe kind of task. And so what you're looking at here is really the event-related potential of the brain in response to emotion-related cues like angry or happy faces. Angry are in red, and happy faces are in black. And the idea is that the greater the magnitude of this waveform, the more engagement there is of brain resources towards that stimulus. And you can see there's more engagement towards happy faces than angry faces, even at the post MBCT. And this was done pre and post mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So what you first see is that there's also earlier latencies of this P1 response. And P1 is a very early attentional marker of attention happening between 80 and maybe 120 milliseconds, really very quick, rapid activity in the brain. And it suggests that there's attending to emotional phases earlier following mindfulness, that there's earlier attention allocation following mindfulness. Now, the amplitude differences are showing that there's greater hypervigilance to angry faces before mindfulness than there is post-mindfulness. So there's more allocation to paying attention towards the angry faces before suggesting more hypervigilance, and afterwards less hypervigilance. And similar to angry faces, there's increased amplitude of the P1 response to happy faces following mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, suggesting more attending to happy faces following mindfulness or more engagement with emotional cues. Let me just conclude by saying that these findings that we're finding even at the ERP level of analysis correlates with the improvements in state and trait anxiety, significant changes in depression, anxiety, and stress across the 8 weeks, and that says to us that potentially attentional bias is a mechanism by which mindfulness may be improving these clinical outcomes. And that's something that we're continuing to explore, and we're presenting some of this data at the Cognitive Neuroscience Society in May. Okay, that was definitely a mouthful, and I'm just going to summarize here by saying that, so mindfulness practices appear to be functioning as a form of systematic mental training that improves self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence, and the underlying neurocognitive processes that I mentioned as potential mechanisms, and that non-inferiority of MBIs to active controls are probably the most salient findings that are emerging today. None of this is even published yet, but I wanted to just give you a sneak peek of what's happening with our Mindfulness Research Collaborative. There's some evidence that it outperforms controls for symptoms of pain, depression, and anxiety. And the salient points in neuroimaging research is that in general, across styles of practice and cross-sectionally, there's decreased activity in brain areas responsible for mind wandering, increased activity in size in brain areas responsible for higher order attention, body awareness, and skill-based learning, and that these attentional biases at early stages of processing, before there's even conscious awareness, are related to these clinical changes following mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So just to tell you what's in our pipeline, we're now looking at very specific attention regulation markers that could be related to levels of expertise as relates to our model that we created with Poppy Schoenberg. And we're working with Katie Chang and Ben Gold out of the Vanderbilt Functional Imaging Institute. And we're working with pain psychologist Steve Brule and the Mindfulness Research Collaborative to look at endogenous inhibitory mechanisms that are contributing to anxiety and chronic pain changes as a result of mindfulness-based interventions. I should just acknowledge my lab, Poppy Schoenberg and Raish Gupta and Emily Moore, and we have a number of RAs in our lab, the Brain Institute, our partners at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, the Mindfulness Research Collaborative, funding from the NCCIH and the Science of Behavioral Change, the Mind and Life Institute, Fetzer, 1440 Foundation, and a number of others, all really contributing to this sort of team science approach that hopefully we are all in this together to better understand how these practices can really improve well-being and suffering. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, this may be a good time to start that. Oh, you're muted, Rael. There you go.
All right, thank you so much, David. Really a comprehensive and informative talk you've provided us all with. I'm going to remind everyone, some people may not have been here at the beginning also, there's a way at this point for this last 20 minutes or so, we have the opportunity for some question and answer discussion period. And there's a way for everyone who's on to indicate that they have a question or a comment by raising your hand. So you go down at the lower part of the screen. If you hover over that, there's a participants icon. And if you click on it, you'll see you have an option as to some kind of some actions you can do, like a thumbs up or a wave. One of them is a hand raise. And if you do the hand raise, I see Felipe Jane has just raised his hand, so I'll come to that in a second. We will see it, and then we can unmute your speaker so that you can speak a question to David, and everyone will hear it. One thing I want to ask at the outset, if you don't mind, Felipe, I'm just going to ask one quick question before opening up to the whole group, which is related to the self-related processing meta-analysis data, which you provided. And of course, I know you have a deep interest. Most people who are interested in meditation from a first-person perspective as practitioners have a pretty deep interest in the relationship between these practices and the experience of self. And in fact, you have published a model that really focuses on the transformations of self at different levels that are characteristic of, and maybe a really kind of comprehensive and informative way of viewing the effects of meditation, right? The self-awareness, reflection, and transformation model. However, what you saw in that meta-analysis you and your colleagues did is that the self-related metrics that are currently available, including the self-compassion scale, did not end up showing much of a difference comparing the MBIs with active controls, which I would take is probably the typical kind of psychotherapy and or group therapy types of interventions. So, of course, I have some data, and others have now started to publish data looking at kind of more creative ways of assessing kind of implicit hardwired aspects of self-related processing. And as you made mention, the default mode network, decreasing of the default mode network activity that seems to be such a characteristic finding across many different labs throughout the world as reflecting something about meditative practice. Seems to indicate there's some disidentification and possibly quieting down of the ruminative kind of self-talk that we engage in habitually as a human species. But there are other ways, of course, of getting at self, and one particular way is to see the extent to which one identifies with the narrative self, the sense of self that's tied to a body and a story of one's life, and even a name, one's image, versus a kind of letting go and the brain no longer being kind of so hooked into that kind of more local representation of self. A couple of other folks have now published findings similar to that. I'm in the process of publishing something along those lines too. I've shared that data with you, but this is all just a lead up to the question of whether you are aware of and are interested / pursuing now other ways of getting at the experience of self that are not so much the positive views of the self, but more the identification. What is the self, the experience of self, and not the thoughts about self, which can be changed through many different therapeutic mechanisms, but the actual identification with self, and whether that might be more specific to mindfulness and or meditative practices. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Rael. I mean, this is the issue, is like what you see on the screen still is, only 5 self-related processing constructs that people are measuring, right? At least in mindfulness-based interventions. So it shows that we're just limiting our assessment of self-related processing to a very small sort of, very small sort of framework for understanding the self. And if we're going to be more broad in our targets of how the self changes over time, then we have to come up with better measures, because right now that's all we have, and it's at least from a self-report measure battery. So even with the objective measures, I think there will have to be ways of taking what you're seeing in the ERP types of analyses and the functional neuroimaging kind of work with how experiential and narrative processing are happening, and correlate that with self-report measures, so that anybody who's doing an MBI type of study who doesn't have access to EEG or fMRI can still assess how the self may be transforming, even at the level of 8 weeks. For example, Eric Garland has got a non-dual awareness scale that he's showing people are changing levels of non-dual awareness even within short, brief interventions. So that's the kind of thing that needs to be then correlated with some of the changes that you're seeing in EEG types of analyses. There's a very large paper that's also coming out that was manifested from a Mind and Life think, specifically on not only the conceptual aspects of self-processing that may be targeted through meditation, like mindfulness, but also what are the measures, the metrics by which we can all use if we're interested in studying the self. And so that's coming out soon. And so I think Eric, and his work is maybe one of the first to sort of target so that non-dual awareness, that the dissolution of self that may be happening through continued practice. But as far as what may happen in 8 weeks of how sort of agentic aspects of self or self-disidentification or reification of the self, all these or the embodiment of self-processing, all these sort of more nuanced aspects of self-processing, or even interoceptive awareness, which relates to self-processing, we're having difficulty measuring. There's the scale called the Maya that focuses on interoceptive awareness, and we're still not, and that particular scale is pretty good at measuring levels of interoceptive awareness, but we're still not showing a lot of changes even across 8-week studies. So I think we just have to be more creative at coming up with more metrics and correlating them with the objective brain types of measures as well. A really important aspect that needs to be targeted.
All right, thank you. Felipe, would you like to chime in here?
Sure, thank you so much, Rael, and thank you, David. That was such an interesting talk. I really appreciate the theoretical models that I think we need to be testing more that you've put forward. I'm a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and the questions that I have are both for you as well as what discussions you may have had within the Mindfulness Research Collaborative. A lot of the data that you presented and that is there within the field is primarily correlational in nature, which is best seen as hypothesis generating. And I'm curious as to your thoughts and how to move the field forward in terms of some of these neural markers and mechanisms. And then the second question that I have concerns dark data in the field. And that oftentimes when reading through studies and reports of randomized controlled trials of mindfulness interventions, I will have this suspicion that quality such as mindfulness or another trait is being measured but is not being reported within the context of the trial. And what we're seeing is a very specific presentation of data that has been collected. And I was wondering whether in the context of your reviews you were noticing any of this, and whether within the collaborative there are any ideas on how to address this issue as well.
Yeah, good point, Felipe. I honestly, so ways to move forward. I think longitudinal designs are probably the best things that need to happen for our field, because we need to know what's happening as one moves from an 8-week course onward, right? And we know the motivations for practice are always self-specific or self-serving in the beginning. And we don't know what happens between there and these more advanced practitioners, right? And the NIH, I'll tell you, is not interested in studying the advanced practitioners as much as they are the 8-week model, clinical outcomes, short-term practice. We want something that's going to happen very quickly. But it may be, in the way John Kabat-Zinn, sort of frames the self-transformative potential of mindfulness, it's a way of being, he describes it. How do you measure a way of being? So I think those sort of self-transformative qualities that happen through dedicated meditation practice are going to be very different than the sort of short-term types of trainings that I see our colleague Fadel Zaidan is on here too. I saw his name, was doing before 20-minute session. So that may indeed change cognition, but how stable are those changes? And we need to look at the longitudinal sort of changes and how stable they are. For example, we're doing a retrospective follow-up of kids exposed to mindfulness back in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in the 90s, 25 years later. And we're now showing that there are no differences, really, not that many, slight differences, but not significantly so, on their lives 25 years later. Why is that? It's potentially because they're not continuing to practice, but we don't know that. So dosage effects are a really important part of this equation. I think the other question about the dark data, and it may be referring to maybe null findings, these types of things.
Yeah, potentially null findings, but simply that within the reporting of some of the randomized controlled trials coming out, you'll see things like, we did a trial of a mindfulness-based intervention. We studied one self-report measure and one biomarker, and here are the results. And it's hard to believe that the person has gone through all of this effort to conduct a large RCT, and they've only studied one measure and one biomarker. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, just in terms of the transparency within the field and what's being measured and what's being studied, kind of what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that is an ethical question for us as a field, and I think we should be better than most people at really leading science in reporting, or at least reporting our methodologies before we start the trials. There is some effort to do that in these open science platforms, and most of it is coming from the contemplative science and mindfulness community. I think that's really helpful to see those types of efforts, because then it shows you these are the outcomes that we're interested in, and it holds you to those methods. You must report them afterwards and not just cherry pick the things that came out significant, right? Or do some fishing expeditions, which a lot of scientists do because of the pressures to publish or perish, right? And so there are a lot of data out there that, that haven't been replicated also. And those findings, like changes in structure of the brain, haven't been replicated significantly. I know that there are efforts to try to replicate some of that data now, and there's difficulty to try to do that. The findings don't always come out, but whether or not that's published is depending on the scientist. So we need to, I think, just be better as a field at supporting that level of open, open sort of science platforms, and being more ethical in the way we share data, because there's probably plenty of data out there that hasn't been shared that are either null in terms of their findings, or that didn't come out in the way that we expected them to. So, we looked where they did come out. There's a lot of room for improvement, but this is a problem throughout science, right? I mean, it's not just the field of mindfulness research. It's the same goes for, things like CBT, or any other type of psychotherapy. It's, we're always looking, it's hard to do clinical research, and, the larger trials are necessary to really show effect sizes. But I think as science becomes more individualized in their approach, we're going to better be able to target which subpopulations are going to best be served by predicting outcomes more in subpopulations. And so that's something we can also improve. I don't know if Rael or anyone else wants to comment there.
Go ahead, Felipe.
No, I just think so much. I appreciate it. So taking away from your response, it sounds like there hasn't been much discussion, at least within the collaborative, of these kinds of issues, which, you know, as an individual researcher, kind of mostly working alone, I'm just curious about what's going on in other people's minds. But also, I do wonder whether that kind of effort would be beneficial to the field to gather all that kind of data that is potentially not being shown or published.
So I'll tell you this, Felipe, I'm on the program planning committee for the Contemplative Research Conference that's happening in November, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. And if it still happens, it'll happen in some form, maybe virtually. In any case, we'll put that on the list. That's an important discussion and dialogue that needs to happen amongst, all of the scholars and scientists that are out there. So agree. All right, thank you for speaking up about it.
Absolutely.
See a smiling Fadl with this hand.
I have a question for Dave. Am I skipping the line? Is there a line, Rael?
No, you're at the top of the list there.
That's
always top of the list.
So first off, that was a great talk per usual, Dave. Very engaging. You have a really great way of delivering this pretty dense literature. I find the discussions of the mind to be quite esoteric, and you did a really good job of making it as user-friendly as possible. One of the questions I have relate to minding the hype of mindfulness research and how a lot of these clinical trials, these meta-analyses and these systematic reviews are showing that there is similar efficacy between cognitive behavioral therapy, other therapies, and mindfulness. So one, I just want to state that some of these reviews include meditations that are not mindfulness. And that needs to be delineated as well, especially the Goyal is the classic 2014 paper that people refer to.
Yep.
Second, I think it's also important to note that mindfulness is unique to these other therapies because it's self-facilitated. It's not contingent on a drug, another therapist, etc. And you can learn basically the recipe so that you can cook for yourself at any time you want, which makes this technique very unique. And tertiary, I wanted to ask you about what you thought. So we see similar efficacy between mindfulness and other leading cognitive therapies, but what about the mechanisms? Does mindfulness also use the same mechanisms as these other behavioral therapies? And if so, what's that mean? And if not, what's that mean? Yeah. And I'll take my answer off the air.
It's a great question. Thanks for pointing that out with the Goyal review versus some of the ones that are coming out now. So the ones that I was showing you definitely really, we're talking about, a really, contemplative scientists doing these reviews. And that means that they have a practice themselves, and we're really trying to figure out, is this a mindfulness intervention or not? Using very stringent criteria. If they're doing relaxation, not mindfulness. Even Yi-Wan Tang's work with IBMT, that wasn't considered mindfulness, so it wasn't included. Your work that was for 20-minute sessions didn't have homework, so we didn't include it, but we talked about it in the discussion. So I think we're trying to be as rigorous as possible, but also inclusive to say, okay, so even if 4 20-minute sessions without homework has an effect on cognition, we need to talk about that and just say, if we didn't include it, then we would be missing that sort of gem of data saying that, okay, that there's effects on cognition even at 4 20-minute sessions. That's important. But what is the standard model, which was I think version 1, MBSR, right? That was version 1. Now there's so many modified versions that people are coming out with. We need to at least base everything on the standard, but then the trials are going to have to come out for each particular modification to show it's as good as MBSR. And then we move towards looking specifically at how those modified versions can be differentially engaging those mechanisms from treatment as usual or like something like CBT. Now, I think your point is a good one. When I talk about, emotion regulation in general, in the brain, you see frontal limbic types of types of activity that reflect emotion regulation. Between CBT and mindfulness, it's going to look very similar, but there may be some nuanced differences. For example, even your work has shown differences between, say, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity versus maybe more ventrolateral activity in the prefrontal cortex as being very differentially engaging for a CBT versus something that may be more mindful in its approach. So just having open awareness may inhibit types of emotional reactivity, types of responses in a different way than suppressing or avoiding different emotions. So there's going to be a lot of overlap, I would say, between these mechanisms. And I think it's our job to figure out how they differ. And that's going to take a lot more NIH funding and other forms of funding to really to demonstrate those differences. But we're not there yet. We are just not there yet. And so I think your work and many others like you are on the cusp of the most interesting types of differentiation between those mechanisms. But in general, we say self-regulation is the same for CBT or MBCT or MBSR. Hopefully that was satisfying.
Thanks, David. So we have one more person who's been waiting a little while to ask a question. And then we're also coming to the end of our time. But I'm going to open this up to Joshua Grainer. Joshua? Just 1 second. I think it's, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Am I off mute? Yeah. So, one of the questions that I have, that I've had for a long time is that, we're studying different forms of mindfulness, different techniques within mindfulness. One of the, and if we were to think about it, one of the reasons is because we want to empower people to adopt these various practices in order to enhance their life and their well-being. I'm wondering because what's happening is in the research we're removing mindfulness, that this dharana practice from the Yoga Sutras, from the rest of the sutras, from the rest of the practices. For example, asana practice, pranayama practice, dhyana practice, which is the contemplation. One of the things I would really love to see at some point is how a single modality, for example, mindfulness, compares to a multimodality, complete lifestyle where somebody is doing, 8 to 12 minutes of movement practice beforehand, followed by some form of Kriya Yoga breath work afterwards, and then into the meditation practices, the mindfulness, and then into the contemplation as the Yoga Sutras teach. That is something that, of course, it'd be difficult to tickle out the data through research, but I think in that more kind of global multimodality approach, I think that we would probably be able to see a more robust practice that's able to have a much greater effect on the well-being of our patients. So I'm just wondering, has there been much discussion here among you heavy hitters of research to look at these multimodality effects? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that, especially in the Yoga Sutras and yoga in general, is that there's just so little data right now on yoga specific, like at all, that even to bring it up is like really a mixed bag, because there's so much that needs to be done just to understand how yoga works because of its multimodal sort of approach, right? There's so many aspects of the 8 limbs that you can either dismantle and break apart and see how each limb is unique and contributing to cognitive and emotional functioning or physiological effects. For example, there's now data showing that even paced breathing can be just as effective as an 8-week mindfulness course, or even in a state-dependent way. in regulating stress. So, pranayama, in itself could be effective on its own at doing a lot of improvements in stress-related outcomes or pain-related outcomes. But as a multimodal approach, as a lifestyle, that is much more complex and has not been done yet in any sort of rigorous way. But certainly it could be done as an 8-week MBI in comparison to a lifestyle. But again, that would have to be longitudinal time, because now you could do something cross-sectional. You can say, I'm going to take a bunch of yoga practitioners who have been doing this for 20 years and compare their brains to an 8-week MBI and say, what happens, how are they different, right? And again, that would only be correlational. And you would be able to say, is it the self-specific sort of effects that these particular people with these different movements in their brain are gravitating to a lifestyle of yoga? Or is it a result of doing the practice for 25 years? That is not going to be clear. And so we need to do those appropriate longitudinal designs to really understand how people are changing as a result of that kind of lifestyle. Meaning, as soon as somebody starts that kind of lifestyle for 6 months to a year out, how they're changing. And then vary, how the asana or regular asanas function versus the whole dharana, dhyana, all the different meditation styles, the analytical styles of meditation. We don't even know how analytical meditation or visualization styles of meditation differ in relation to focused attention and open monitoring, let alone the whole Yoga Sutra or 8 limbs types of lifestyle. So I think there's a lot to do. And like I said, there's 10,000 studies in 20 years and 120,000 studies on cardiovascular disease. So we still have a lot of research to do to provide evidence for really bringing Ashtanga into integrative with an evidence base, a strong evidence base. That may not be satisfying.
Excellent. Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Sure, Joshua. Thanks. Thanks for the question.
Well, we are coming a couple of minutes over now, so I'm going to go ahead and start just kind of wrapping up. Again, I really want to thank you, David, for giving this lecture for all of us. I am also feel a little called to just for a moment acknowledge the relevance of these kinds of powerful practices that we're referring to, contemplative practices, mindfulness, in relationship to dealing with our greatly suffering world generally, and the particular unique type of suffering that we as a world community are experiencing now. In some ways, it's a real opportunity for us all to be kind of more awake to our global interconnectedness than usual. And there are also extra stresses that we're all dealing with, even if it's only vicariously. But the relevance of transforming the experience of self from a local identified with one's own thoughts, feelings, emotions, and a story to some more all-encompassing sense of identification with the whole does seem really especially appropriate now when we're going through these periods of transition.
I agree. Can I say one thing on that note? Yeah. This is, we just published this big special issue on mindfulness with a lot of really great commentaries by great people, about 55 or 100 different contributors. And John Kabat-Zinn wrote this forward. And this is the title. He wrote that where we're at with mindfulness is that we're at this developing seeds of a necessary global renaissance in the making, the refining of psychology's understanding of the nature of mind, self, and embodiment through the lens of mindfulness and its origins at a key inflection point for the species. And that is a pretty profound statement coming from one of the founders of this field, so to speak. that this is more than just the 8-week intervention, about an 8-week intervention. It's about something much broader than that. I think that's what you're alluding to, Rael. So I'm just going to leave that up there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. And that is exactly what I'm alluding to, and it's really related to the the opportunity and the challenge of being in academia. The Center for Mindfulness Science housed at the USC, and the work you're doing also in academia at Vanderbilt. Many of the people on this call have some affiliation with academics, and yet are also called to somehow be involved with this other aspect of thinking about studying and potentially demonstrating the possibilities for human transformation through these kinds of lens. And I think there's a very useful discussion to be had around all those topics for those of us in the at the interface, where we're not just practitioners or teachers or students, but also active in the academic and scholarship around understanding this and its possible relevance to humankind as a whole. But we'll save that for another time. I think you've done a great job in summarizing why it's an important thing to be cognizant about it, kind of what's been done to date and where the field has to go in its maturation. And thank you all for tuning in and for being with us. We're going to have another event pretty soon, which I'll be spreading the word about via Facebook and as well as our listserv. Again, if you go to the mindfulscience.usc.edu website, you can sign up to be on our listserv if you're not already and would like to be kept informed. And I wish you a good rest of your day to everyone.
Thank you all for being present. It's so wonderful to see all your faces and names. Happy Earth Day.